Elon Musk disguises himself as poor to test police. You won't believe what happens next. The park was quiet that afternoon, save for the occasional rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze and the distant hum of city traffic. A man sat on a weathered blue bench near the fountain, his hood pulled low over his face. His coat, patched and frayed at the edges, looked like it hadn't seen a washing machine in years. A brown paper bag rested beside him, crumpled and stained, and his sneakers, mismatched and worn, peeked out beneath the hem of his jeans. He didn't look up when a police cruiser slowly rolled into the park's parking lot. Two officers stepped out, their boots crunching on the gravel as they surveyed the scene. One of them, a younger officer with a buzz cut and a badge that gleamed in the afternoon sun, adjusted his belt as he exchanged a glance with his partner. Another vagrant, the younger officer muttered, nodding toward the man on the bench. "This park is turning into a homeless camp." His partner, a stocky man in his 40s with a tired expression and a coffee-stained uniform, sighed. "Let's just see what he's up to. Maybe he's harmless." The two officers approached the bench, their footsteps heavy and deliberate. The man didn't react, his gaze fixed on the ground as if he hadn't noticed them. "You can't sit here all day," the younger officer said sharply, his tone clipped. "This is a public park, not your living room." The man finally looked up, his eyes partially hidden under the shadow of his hood. He said nothing, his expression unreadable, and reached into the paper bag beside him. The younger officer tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward the baton at his hip. "Easy," the older officer murmured, though his voice lacked conviction. "Let's not escalate this." The man pulled out a sandwich wrapped in wax paper and began unwrapping it slowly, his movements deliberate but not threatening. He took a bite, chewing quietly as if the officers weren't even there. "Did you hear me?" the younger officer snapped, stepping closer. "I said you can't sit here all day. You got somewhere to go." The man swallowed his bite, his gaze flicking to the officer briefly before returning to his sandwich. "I'm not bothering anyone," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Just eating my lunch." "That's not the point," the younger officer shot back, his tone growing harsher. "People like you make the place look bad. You scare off families, tourists." The older officer sighed again, crossing his arms as he watched the exchange. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice gruff but less aggressive than his partner's. The man hesitated, his fingers tightening slightly on the sandwich. "Nick," he said finally. "Nick Carter." The younger officer smirked, clearly unimpressed. "Nick Carter, huh? You a Backstreet Boy in your spare time?" The man didn't respond, his expression remaining neutral as he took another bite of his sandwich. His silence seemed to irritate the younger officer further, and he stepped closer, looming over the seated figure. "Let me see some ID," he demanded. The man set his sandwich down carefully, reaching into the pocket of his coat. He pulled out a worn leather wallet and handed it to the officer, who flipped it open with a practiced motion. The ID inside looked legitimate, though it bore no resemblance to the man's current disheveled appearance. The officer frowned, scrutinizing the ID before handing it back. "What are you doing here, Carter?" he asked. "Why aren't you at a shelter or something?" "I like the fresh air," the man replied simply, slipping the wallet back into his pocket. "Is that a crime?" The older officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his partner. "He's not doing anything illegal," he said quietly. "We can't just kick him out." "Maybe not," the younger officer muttered, his eyes narrowing, "but we can make it uncomfortable for him." The man's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't respond. Instead, he picked up his sandwich again, taking another slow, deliberate bite. The tension between him and the officers crackled in the air, drawing the attention of a few passers-by who slowed their steps, their curiosity piqued. "Hey!" a woman walking her dog called out hesitantly. "He's not hurting anyone. Why are you bothering him?" The younger officer turned toward her, his face hardening. "Ma'am, this is none of your concern. It's a public park," the woman shot back. "He has just as much right to be here as anyone else." The older officer stepped in, raising a placating hand. "Ma'am, we're just doing our job," he said, Please, move along. The woman hesitated, her grip tightening on her dog's leash as she glanced between the man on the bench and the officers. Finally, she shook her head and continued walking, muttering something under her breath. The man watched her go, a flicker of something. Amusement? Annoyance? Passing across his face. He set his sandwich down again, brushing crumbs from his lap. "Am I free to go?" he asked, his tone calm but with a subtle edge. "You're not under arrest," the older officer said, though his partner shot him a warning glance. "But you might want to find somewhere else to sit." The man nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on the younger officer for a moment longer than necessary. Then he stood, picking up his paper bag and tucking it under his arm. He was tall, taller than either of the officers had realized, and as he adjusted the hood of his coat, a lock of dark hair fell across his forehead. "Have a nice day," he said, his voice low but pointed. The younger officer watched him go, his expression darkening. "You see the way he looked at me?" he muttered to his partner. "Guy thinks he's better than us." "Let it go," the older officer replied wearily. "He's not worth the paperwork." As the man walked away, his steps slow and measured, the tension in the park began to ease. But something lingered in the air. An unspoken challenge, a spark of defiance that hadn't been extinguished. The younger officer stared after him, his jaw tightening. "I don't trust him," he said finally. "There's something off about him." "You don't have to trust him," his partner replied. "You just have to leave him alone." The man disappeared down the path, the paper bag still tucked under his arm. But as he rounded the corner, his lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. As the man rounded the bend and disappeared from sight, the younger officer muttered something under his breath, his frustration evident. "I'm telling you, there's something off about him," he said, staring after the figure as if trying to memorize every detail. "Drop it," his older partner replied, pinching the bridge of his nose. "He's gone. No harm done." "No harm yet," the younger officer shot back. "You saw his ID. Looked real." "Sure. But who carries around a wallet like that when they're dressed like him? And what's he doing in this park? Anyway, it doesn't add up." The older officer shrugged, already turning back toward the cruiser. "Not our problem," he said. "We're not here to solve riddles. We're here to keep the peace." But the younger officer wasn't so quick to let it go. His mind raced, piecing together the small details that had seemed off. The way the man had spoken, calm and calculated, like he wasn't afraid of them. The way he had sized them up with a single glance. The way he had walked away, tall and deliberate, like a man used to being in control. It didn't sit right with him. "He's hiding something," the younger officer muttered, his jaw tightening as he climbed back into the cruiser. His partner sighed but didn't argue, knowing better than to waste energy on what he saw as the kid's paranoia. Meanwhile, the man in the hooded coat had made his way to a quieter part of the park, settling on another bench beneath a cluster of old oak trees. The paper bag rested beside him once again, untouched, as he leaned back and closed his eyes. His posture was relaxed, his expression unreadable, but there was an air of purpose about him, like a man waiting for something or someone. It didn't take long for his solitude to be interrupted. A pair of joggers approached, their sneakers crunching on the gravel path. They slowed as they passed, their conversation trailing off as they noticed him sitting there. One of them, a middle-aged man with a sleek fitness tracker and a look of mild disdain, nudged his companion and muttered something under his breath. The woman beside him glanced at the man on the bench, her expression tightening into one of discomfort. "Should we call someone?" the man whispered, his voice carrying just enough to reach the ears of the person they were talking about. "He looks sketchy." The man on the bench opened his eyes, his gaze flicking to the joggers briefly before returning to the sky. He said nothing, his face betraying no reaction, but the tension in the air thickened. The joggers exchanged a look before picking up their pace, their footsteps fading as they hurried down the path. It wasn't long before another interruption came. This time, it was a group of teenagers on bikes, their laughter loud and carefree as they weaved between the trees. One of them spotted the man on the bench and slowed to a stop, gesturing for his friends to follow. "Check this out," the boy said, grinning as he pointed at the man. "Yo, you homeless or something?" The man didn't respond, his expression calm as he watched the boy with a detached curiosity. The teenager, emboldened by the lack of reaction, leaned closer, his grin widening. "You lose your house playing Fortnite or what?" His friends laughed, their voices a cacophony of jeers and taunts. One of them pulled out a phone, holding it up as if to record the encounter. "Say something for the camera, man," he said, his tone mocking. "Tell us your life story." The man finally spoke, his voice low and measured. "You should get going," he said, his gaze steady. "This isn't a place for games." The teenagers hesitated, their laughter faltering as they exchanged uncertain glances. There was something in his tone, something quiet but commanding, that made them second-guess their decision to stick around. But before they could decide whether to leave or push further, the sound of a police cruiser pulling up nearby drew their attention. The younger officer stepped out first, his eyes immediately locking onto the group. "What's going on here?" he called, his tone sharp. The teenagers scattered like leaves in the wind, their bikes kicking up dust as they pedaled away. The officer barely spared them a glance. His focus zeroed in on the man on the bench. "You again," he said, striding toward him. "Couldn't find another park to loiter in?" The man didn't move, his posture still relaxed as he regarded the officer with a calm gaze. "Is sitting on a bench against the law now?" he asked. The officer's jaw tightened, his frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. "You've got a smart mouth," he said, stopping a few feet away. "I don't like smart mouths." "Good thing I'm not here to make friends," the man replied evenly. The older officer joined his partner, his expression one of mild annoyance as he looked between the two. "What's going on here?" he asked. "Why are we back?" "I don't trust him," the younger officer said, his eyes never leaving the man on the bench. "He's up to something. He's sitting on a bench," the older officer said, exasperated. "Let it go." But the younger officer wasn't listening. He took a step closer, his hand resting on the baton at his hip. "What's in the bag?" he demanded. The man tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. "Lunch. Prove it." The man raised an eyebrow, but he didn't argue. He picked up the paper bag and held it out, letting the officer peer inside. The younger officer frowned, his suspicion deepening as he saw nothing but an apple, a sandwich, and a bottle of water. "You got something else on you?" the officer asked. "Something you don't want us to find?" The man set the bag down, his movements calm and deliberate. "I've got nothing to hide," he said. "But if you're looking for trouble, I'm not the one you'll find it with." The older officer sighed, shaking his head. "Let's go," he said to his partner. "We've got better things to do." But the younger officer hesitated, his instincts screaming that there was more to this man than met the eye. He didn't know what it was yet, but he was determined to find out. The younger officer's jaw tightened as he stared at the man on the bench, the weight of his suspicion pressing heavily on the encounter. His partner had already turned to head back to the cruiser, but he wasn't ready to let it go. Something about this man, his calm demeanor, his unshakable composure, set his teeth on edge. It was like the guy was playing a game, and the officer hated the feeling that he might be losing. "You're awfully calm for someone getting this much attention," the younger officer said, his voice low and sharp. "Most people in your situation would be a little more nervous." The man didn't flinch. "Most people aren't breaking any laws," he replied simply. "Are you saying I should be nervous?" The officer stepped closer, his hand still resting on the baton at his hip. "I'm saying you're acting like you've got nothing to lose," he said. "And that makes me wonder what you're hiding." "I've got nothing to hide," the man replied evenly. "You've searched me, you've searched my bag. If you're still looking for something, that's on you." The older officer, standing a few feet away with one hand on the cruiser door, sighed heavily. "Come on," he called to his partner. "He's not doing anything. Let's move on." But the younger officer ignored him, his eyes narrowing as he studied the man in the hooded coat. "You've got an answer for everything, don't you?" he said, his tone laced with irritation. "You think you're smarter than me?" The man tilted his head slightly, his gaze unflinching. "I'm not trying to prove anything," he said. "I'm just sitting on a bench." The officer took another step closer, the tension between them thickening. "You think you're clever," he muttered. "You think you can just sit here and make me look like an idiot? I think you're making yourself look that way," the man said softly, his voice calm but with an edge that cut deep. The older officer stiffened, turning back toward the scene. "Enough," he said firmly, stepping between his partner and the man on the bench. "We're done here." But the younger officer wasn't ready to back down. "No, we're not," he snapped, his frustration boiling over. "This guy's playing us. I can feel it. Feel it all you want," the older officer said, his tone sharp. "You don't have anything on him. Leave it alone." For a moment, it looked like the younger officer might argue. His face flushed with anger and humiliation. But then he stepped back, his hand reluctantly dropping from his baton. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "We'll go." The man on the bench said nothing, watching silently as the officers turned and walked back toward their cruiser. But as the younger officer reached the car, he paused, glancing back over his shoulder. His eyes met the man's for a brief moment, and in that instant, an unspoken challenge passed between them. In the cruiser, the older officer shook his head as he started the engine. "You've got to let this stuff go," he said. "It's not worth the trouble." "It's not about trouble," the younger officer muttered, staring out the window. "It's about respect. That guy thinks he's untouchable. He's not." The older officer sighed, pulling the cruiser onto the park's main road. "Just let it go," he repeated. "We've got better things to do." But the younger officer couldn't let it go. His mind raced with possibilities, each one more frustrating than the last. Who was this guy? Why did he act like he had nothing to fear? And why did it feel like he was hiding something, even though there was no evidence to prove it? Back on the bench, the man watched the cruiser disappear around the corner, his expression unreadable. He reached into the paper bag beside him, pulling out the sandwich he had started earlier. As he unwrapped it, his gaze flicked briefly toward the cluster of trees nearby, where a man in a gray hoodie stood watching him. The man in the hoodie stepped forward, his movements cautious but deliberate. He stopped a few feet from the bench, glancing around to make sure they weren't being watched. "How's it going?" he asked, his voice low. The man on the bench took a bite of his sandwich, chewing thoughtfully before replying. "About as expected," he said. "They're suspicious, but they haven't figured anything out yet." The man in the hoodie nodded, his hands tucked into his pockets. "Think they'll come back?" "They always do," the man on the bench said, his lips curving into a faint smile. "Curiosity gets the better of them." The man in the hoodie hesitated, his brow furrowing. "You sure about this? You're pushing them pretty hard." "That's the point," the man on the bench replied. "I want to see how far they'll go." Nearby, a jogger paused to tie their shoe, their eyes flicking toward the two men briefly before they continued on their way. The man in the hoodie stepped back, his posture tense. "Just be careful," he said. "If this goes sideways." "It won't," the man on the bench interrupted. His voice was calm, but there was a quiet authority in his tone that left no room for argument. "I've got this." The man in the hoodie nodded reluctantly, retreating back into the trees. The man on the bench took another bite of his sandwich, his gaze returning to the path ahead. He didn't have to wait long before the familiar hum of the police cruiser reached his ears again. The younger officer was back. The familiar hum of the police cruiser drew closer, the sound blending with the rustling leaves and distant chatter of the park. The man on the bench didn't move, his posture relaxed as he finished the last bite of his sandwich. His paper bag, now empty, rested neatly beside him. But his calm demeanor betrayed none of the sharp awareness in his eyes as the cruiser slowed to a stop nearby. The younger officer was out of the car before it had fully come to a halt, his steps brisk and purposeful as he approached the bench. His older partner followed at a slower pace, his expression one of mounting frustration. "You again," the younger officer said, his tone sharp. His gaze darted to the empty paper bag before flicking back to the man's face. "Didn't we just have this conversation?" The man looked up, his expression neutral. "We did," he said evenly. "I didn't realize sitting on a bench was grounds for a second visit." "Don't get smart with me," the officer snapped, his hand resting on his hip. "You're still here, still acting suspicious. I don't know what your game is, but I'm going to find out." The older officer stepped in, raising a hand to his partner. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice low but firm. "We already cleared him." "He's up to something," the younger officer insisted, his eyes never leaving the man on the bench. "I can feel it." "That's not how the law works," the older officer said, his tone tinged with exasperation. "You can't just hassle someone because you feel like it." "Then why is he still here?" the younger officer shot back. "Why hasn't he left? Normal people don't hang around like this." "Normal people," the man on the bench repeated quietly, his voice calm but pointed. "What exactly does that mean?" The younger officer's jaw tightened, and he took another step forward. "It means people who don't make a habit of sitting around parks, waiting for attention." "Maybe I just like the view," the man replied, his tone unbothered. "Or maybe I don't feel like being rushed out of a public space for no reason." The older officer sighed, his hand rubbing his temple as he glanced at his partner. "You're escalating this for no reason," he said. "Let it go." But the younger officer wasn't listening. He gestured toward the man on the bench, his frustration boiling over. "If he's got nothing to hide, then he won't mind answering a few more questions." The man tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. "What do you want to know?" he asked. "Why are you here?" the younger officer demanded. "Why this park? Why this bench?" "Do I need a reason?" the man replied. "I wasn't aware public spaces came with prerequisites." The officer's eyes narrowed. "What's your deal? You're too calm, too calculated. People don't just sit like this unless they're planning something." "Planning what?" the man asked, his voice measured. "A picnic? A peaceful afternoon? You tell me what crime I'm committing, and I'll tell you why I'm here." The older officer stepped forward again, his patience clearly wearing thin. "That's enough," he said, his tone firm. "You've got nothing. Let's move on." But the younger officer refused to back down. He reached for his radio, his thumb pressing the button as he spoke. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. I need a record check on an individual named Nick Carter. ID provided earlier." The man on the bench raised an eyebrow but said nothing, his expression unreadable as he watched the officer. The radio crackled in response, the dispatcher's voice coming through faintly. "Copy that, Unit 12. Stand by." The older officer groaned, throwing up his hands. "You're making this into something it's not," he muttered. "This is going to come back on us." "Then he shouldn't have anything to worry about," the younger officer retorted, his gaze fixed on the man. "If he's clean, he's clean." The man shifted slightly on the bench, leaning back as he folded his arms. "You're very determined," he said. "It's almost flattering." "Don't try to play me," the officer snapped. "You're not as clever as you think you are." "Maybe not," the man replied. "But I don't need to be clever to sit on a bench." The radio crackled again, cutting through the tension. Unit 12. No records found under the name Nick Carter matching the provided ID. The younger officer stiffened, his hand tightening on the radio. "What do you mean, no records?" "Exactly what it sounds like," the dispatcher replied. "No matches in the system. Either the ID is fake, or there's an error in the database." The older officer's face darkened as he turned to his partner. "That's enough," he said sharply. "We're not turning this into a witch hunt. Let's go." But the younger officer's suspicion only deepened, his frustration bubbling over into barely concealed anger. "He's lying," he said, pointing at the man on the bench. "That ID's fake and he knows it." The man's gaze remained calm, though there was a flicker of something, amusement, in his eyes. "If that's true," he said, "then why didn't you spot it earlier?" The officer opened his mouth to respond, but his partner cut him off. "We're done here," the older officer said firmly, grabbing his arm and steering him toward the cruiser. "Let's go before you make this worse." The younger officer reluctantly allowed himself to be led away, but his glare remained fixed on the man as they returned to the car. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath, slamming the door behind him. The man watched the cruiser pull away, his expression unreadable once again. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small device that fit neatly into the palm of his hand. As he turned it over, a faint smirk crossed his lips. The game was unfolding exactly as he'd expected. The cruiser circled back to the parking lot, the younger officer gripping the wheel tightly, his knuckles white as his frustration boiled over. "I know something's off with this guy," he muttered, his eyes flicking toward the park's paths, scanning for the man. "No ID in the system? Who doesn't have a record of some kind?" "Plenty of people," the older officer replied, his voice weary. "Not everyone's hiding something. Maybe the database just didn't update. Ever think of that?" The younger officer shook his head, his jaw tight. "No, there's more to this. The way he talks, the way he moves, he's not just some random guy. He's playing us, and I'm not about to let him get away with it." "Let him get away with what?" The older officer shot back, his frustration finally bubbling to the surface. "Sitting on a bench? Eating a sandwich? You're acting like he's some kind of mastermind." "He might be," the younger officer muttered, pulling the car into a stop just near the cluster of trees where they'd last seen the man. Sure enough, he was still there, sitting calmly on the same bench as before. His hood was pushed back slightly now, revealing more of his face, though his posture remained relaxed, unbothered by their return. The paper bag beside him was now folded neatly, tucked against his leg as if to signal that he was finished eating. He looked up as the officers approached, his expression unreadable. "You boys missed me already?" he asked, his tone calm but with a faint hint of amusement. The younger officer stiffened, his frustration bubbling over. "We're not done with you yet," he said sharply, stepping closer. "That ID you gave us? It doesn't exist. Care to explain?" The man raised an eyebrow, his gaze steady. "Maybe your system's broken," he replied. "Or maybe you're just looking for something that's not there." "Don't get smart with me," the younger officer snapped. "I know a fake when I see one." The older officer stepped in, his tone more measured. "We're giving you a chance to come clean," he said. "If there's something you need to tell us, now's the time." The man leaned back slightly, his posture still relaxed as he studied the two officers. "What exactly do you think I'm hiding?" he asked, his tone curious. "A secret identity? A criminal record? Or maybe a sinister plan to overthrow the local park bench economy?" The older officer pressed a hand to his temple, clearly exhausted by the exchange. "Look," he said, "you're not making this easier on yourself. If you've got a reason for being here, just tell us. Otherwise, my partner's not going to let this go." "I think we both know that's true," the man replied, his gaze flicking to the younger officer. "You've made up your mind about me, haven't you? Nothing I say is going to change that." The younger officer stepped closer, his hand resting on his baton. "You think you're clever," he said, his voice low and tense. "You think you can just sit there, acting like you're better than us." "I don't think I'm better than anyone," the man said evenly. "But I do think you've got something to prove." The words landed like a slap, and the younger officer's face flushed with anger. Before his partner could intervene, he stepped even closer, looming over the man on the bench. "You think this is a game?" he demanded. "You think you can just sit there and make me look like a fool?" "I think you're doing a fine job of that on your own," the man replied calmly. The older officer grabbed his partner's arm, pulling him back slightly. "Enough," he said firmly. "We're not doing this." But the younger officer wasn't ready to back down. He gestured toward the man, his frustration spilling over. "He's hiding something," he said. "I know it. He's too calm, too confident. Nobody acts like that unless they've got something to hide." The older officer sighed, his patience wearing thin. "Even if he is, it's not our job to harass him until we find something. We don't have probable cause." "Drop it." "Probable cause?" the younger officer repeated, his voice rising. "How about a fake ID? How about refusing to leave when we've asked him to?" "It's a public park," the older officer said, his tone sharp. He doesn't have to leave unless he's breaking the law. And so far, he hasn't. The man on the bench watched the exchange quietly, his expression calm but observant. He seemed to be taking mental notes, cataloging every word, every movement, as if this were all part of a larger plan. "You're going to regret this," the younger officer muttered, pointing a finger at the man. "Whatever you're up to, I'll figure it out." The man tilted his head slightly, his lips curving into a faint smile. "I'm sure you will," he said. "Good luck with that." The words hung in the air, their calm defiance only fueling the younger officer's frustration. He turned and stormed back to the cruiser, his partner following reluctantly. As they drove away, the younger officer's mind raced, his thoughts consumed by the man on the bench. "He's playing us," he muttered, his grip tightening on the wheel. "I know it." Or maybe, the older officer said tiredly, "You're just reading too much into this." But the younger officer wasn't listening. He was already forming a plan, determined to uncover the truth about the man on the bench, no matter what it took. Back at the park, the man watched the cruiser disappear, his calm demeanor unshaken. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out the small device once again. As he turned it over in his hand, a faint smile played on his lips. The game was far from over, and he was ready for whatever came next. The tension in the air was palpable as the younger officer approached the bench one more time, this time alone. His partner had finally had enough, refusing to be part of what he called an unnecessary vendetta. But for the younger officer, this wasn't about a vendetta, it was about control. It was about getting to the bottom of whatever this man was hiding. He strode toward the bench with renewed determination, his hand resting on his baton as he mentally rehearsed his next move. The man was still there, as calm and composed as ever, his hood pushed back completely now, revealing more of his face. His expression was relaxed, but his eyes carried a sharpness that unnerved the officer. "You've got some nerve," the officer said as he stopped a few feet away, his voice low and tense. "Sitting here, acting like you own the place." The man looked up, his gaze steady. "It's a public park," he replied. "Nobody owns it." "You know what I mean," the officer snapped. "You've been playing games with me all day, and I'm done. You're gonna tell me who you really are, or I'll make sure you regret it." The man tilted his head slightly, his lips curving into a faint smile. "You really want to know who I am?" he asked. "Enough with the smart remarks," the officer growled. "Let's see some real ID this time. No tricks, no fake names. Just the truth." The man reached into his coat pocket slowly, his movements deliberate. The officer tensed, his hand tightening on his baton as he watched every move, ready to react at the slightest sign of a threat. But the man didn't pull out a weapon or another questionable ID. Instead, he produced a sleek black smartphone, its polished surface catching the light as he held it up. "Here's the thing," the man said, his tone calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. "I don't need to prove anything to you, but since you're so determined to know the truth, I'll give it to you." He tapped the screen a few times and a video began to play. The officer leaned in slightly, his brow furrowing as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The footage showed the officer himself, standing over the man earlier that day, his tone aggressive as he demanded answers. The audio was crystal clear, every word, every inflection captured in stunning detail. "What is this?" the officer demanded, his voice rising. "This," the man said, "is a live stream. It's been running all day. Every interaction we've had, every word you've said, has been broadcast to millions of people." The officer's face went pale, his grip on his baton faltering. What are you talking about?" The man stood slowly, his full height imposing as he faced the officer. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, his expression calm but unyielding. "I'm not Nick Carter," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "I'm Elon Musk." The officer blinked, his mind reeling as he tried to process the words. "What?" he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "Elon Musk? You're kidding." "I never kid about things like this," Elon replied, his tone even but carrying a quiet authority. "I've been conducting an experiment, testing how people like you treat those you perceive as less fortunate. The officer's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. His mind raced as the pieces began to fall into place. The calm demeanor, the confidence, the subtle but deliberate way the man had handled every interaction. It all made sense now, and the realization hit him like a freight train. "You set me up," the officer said finally, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and panic. "I didn't set you up," Elon replied. "I gave you a choice. Every action you took, every word you said was your own. All I did was observe." The officer's face turned red, his frustration boiling over. "You had no right," he spat. "You had no right to do this." "I had every right," Elon said calmly. "You're a public servant, sworn to protect and serve. But instead of doing your job, you chose to harass someone you thought was beneath you." The officer took a step back, his mind racing as he tried to think of a way out. "You can't use this," he said. "This is entrapment. It's illegal." "It's not entrapment," Elon said. "I didn't force you to do anything. And as for legality, my lawyers would be happy to explain why you don't have a case." The officer's panic deepened as he realized the full scope of what was happening. The live stream, the audience, the undeniable evidence, it was all too much. He had thought he was in control, but now it was clear that Elon had been several steps ahead the entire time. Outside the park, a crowd had begun to gather. News crews were arriving, their cameras trained on the unfolding scene. Reporters whispered into microphones, their excitement palpable as they described the confrontation. The officer turned, his face contorted with humiliation as he realized they were here for him. "This isn't over," he said, his voice shaking as he pointed a finger at Elon. "You won't get away with this." Elon's expression didn't change. "It's already over," he said. "The world's watching now." The younger officer's face was a mask of panic and rage as the weight of the situation bore down on him. His eyes darted to the growing crowd of bystanders, phones raised and recording, and then to the approaching news crews who were eagerly documenting every second. The sudden realization that he had gone from an authority figure to a public spectacle was suffocating. "You think this makes you a hero?" he spat, pointing an accusatory finger at Elon. "Dressing up and playing games? You're nothing but a fraud." Elon didn't flinch. His calm demeanor remained intact, even as the officer's words echoed across the park. "This isn't about me," Elon said, his voice measured but firm. "It's about accountability. It's about how people in positions of power choose to treat those they think are powerless." "Powerless?" the officer barked, his voice rising in desperation. "You're Elon Musk, for God's sake. You're a billionaire. Don't act like you're some saint coming down from the heavens." Elon raised an eyebrow, his expression unmoved. "Exactly," he said. "And yet, you treated me like dirt the moment you assumed I was homeless. Imagine how you treat people who don't have the resources to fight back." The officer's partner arrived on the scene, his face pale as he took in the chaos. He'd been following in the cruiser, but he hadn't anticipated the scale of what was unfolding. He grabbed the younger officer by the arm, pulling him back as he whispered urgently, "Stop talking. You're making it worse. I'm not going to let him get away with this." The younger officer shot back, his voice trembling with anger, but his partner's grip tightened, and the warning in his eyes finally registered. "You already did," the older officer said quietly, his tone heavy with resignation. "Just stop before you dig the hole any deeper." The crowd murmured, their voices a mix of disbelief and indignation. Words like abuse of power and disgrace rippled through the gathering, the condemnation growing louder with each passing moment. The news crews were now fully set up, their cameras zoomed in on the confrontation. Reporters were speaking animatedly into their microphones, their words broadcast live to millions. Elon turned his attention to the crowd, addressing them with the same calm authority he'd shown throughout the day. "This isn't about one bad officer," he said. "It's about a system that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked. It's about holding people accountable, not just for their actions, but for their attitudes." The crowd erupted into applause, the sound reverberating through the park. The younger officer's face flushed red, his humiliation complete as he realized there was no way to regain control of the narrative. He glanced at the cameras, the realization dawning that his every move was being broadcast to the world. "I didn't do anything wrong," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the noise. "I was just doing my job." "Your job is to serve and protect," Elon said, his gaze sharp. "Not to profile, harass, or abuse your authority. And if you can't handle that responsibility, then maybe you shouldn't wear the badge." The officer's partner stepped in again, his tone now pleading. "Let's go," he said. "We need to leave." But before they could retreat, another voice cut through the chaos, a commanding voice that silenced the crowd. "Officers, stand down." Everyone turned to see a woman in a crisp suit approaching, her presence exuding authority. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew exactly how to take control of a situation. The badge clipped to her belt identified her as a high-ranking member of the Internal Affairs Division. The younger officer's eyes widened as she approached, her sharp gaze locking onto him. "You've made quite a mess," she said, her tone cold. "I hope you're prepared to deal with the consequences." "Ma'am, he began, but she held up a hand to silence him. "Save it," she said. "I've already seen the footage, and I think the public's made their opinion pretty clear." She gestured to the crowd, who were now openly booing the younger officer. The Internal Affairs officer turned to Elon, her demeanor softening slightly. "Mr. Musk," she said, "on behalf of the department, I'd like to apologize for what you've been through today. This behavior is unacceptable, and I assure you it will be dealt with." Elon nodded, his expression unreadable. "It's not about me," he said. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The woman nodded, turning back to the younger officer. "Hand over your badge and weapon," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "What?" The officer stammered, his face pale. "You can't be serious." "Do it," she snapped. "You're on administrative leave pending an investigation. And trust me, this investigation will be thorough." The officer's hands trembled as he unclipped his badge and gun, handing them over with a look of utter defeat. The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices a mixture of triumph and relief as justice began to take shape. As the officer was led away, his shoulders slumped, Elon turned to the cameras one last time. "This isn't the end," he said. "It's just the beginning. If we want to create real change, we need to hold people accountable. Not just when they're caught, but every single day." The crowd roared their approval, their applause echoing through the park as the weight of the moment settled over everyone present. The younger officer, now stripped of his authority, was escorted away, his humiliation complete. The news crews lingered, some still capturing shots of the park bench where the day's events had unfolded. Elon remained standing near the fountain, his hands tucked casually into the pockets of his coat, as though this were just another ordinary day. The Internal Affairs officer returned to him, her expression still one of professional seriousness. "Mr. Musk," she began, "I want to personally assure you that this incident will be thoroughly investigated. The department doesn't tolerate this kind of behavior." Elon nodded but didn't smile. "I hope so," he replied, "because it's not about one officer. It's about the culture that allows these things to happen." She hesitated, clearly unsettled by the weight of his words. "I understand," she said finally, "and I'll make sure your concerns are heard." As she walked away, Elon turned back to the bench, the faintest trace of a smile playing on his lips. He sat down again, pulling out his phone and scrolling through the live stream comments. They were pouring in by the thousands, expressions of outrage, support, and shock at what had unfolded. "This is exactly why we need accountability," one comment read. "Elon Musk just exposed a huge problem," another said. "This isn't just about one cop. It's about the whole system." Elon's smile widened slightly as he typed a response. "Change starts with awareness. Let's keep the conversation going." Mrs. Patel, an elderly woman who had been watching everything from the sidelines, approached him cautiously. "I had no idea who you were," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But what you did is brave. You didn't have to do that." Elon looked up, his expression softening. "Sometimes the best way to understand a problem is to experience it firsthand," he said. And sometimes, the only way to fix it is to shine a light on it. She nodded, her eyes glistening with gratitude. Well, thank you, she said, for standing up for all the people who can't. He nodded back, watching as she walked away. Nearby, the officers who remained on scene were speaking with their superiors, their postures tense as they awaited instructions. The younger officer, now stripped of his badge and weapon, sat in the back of another cruiser, his head in his hands. His career, if not his entire life, was in ruins, and the weight of his actions hung heavily over him. The internal affairs officer had already begun reviewing the live stream footage with a team of investigators, their expressions grim as they pieced together the chain of events. For Elon, this was just the beginning of a larger effort to address systemic issues. He had no intention of letting this moment pass without action. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park, Elon stood and stretched. The quiet hum of a sleek black Tesla pulling up to the curb drew his attention, and he smiled faintly as a young assistant stepped out, holding the door open. "Ready to go, sir?" the assistant asked. "Not just yet," Elon replied, his gaze sweeping over the park one last time. He turned back to the bench, pulling out a pen and a scrap of paper from his pocket. Scribbling something quickly, he folded the note and tucked it under the edge of the bench. The assistant looked puzzled but didn't ask questions as Elon finally approached the car. Before stepping in, he glanced back at the crowd, the officers, and the bench where it had all started. "This isn't just about me," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "It's about making sure everyone has a seat at the table or the bench." As the Tesla glided away, the note left behind on the bench fluttered slightly in the breeze. It read, "To the next person who sits here, your story matters. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The crowd began to thin, but the conversations didn't stop. People spoke about what they'd seen, about the abuses of power, and about the unexpected courage of a man who chose to challenge the system from a park bench. The day would live on, not just in the news but in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. And for Elon Musk, the work was far from over. This was just one park, one officer, one moment. But every big change started with a small spark. And as he leaned back in the Tesla, scrolling through the thousands of comments pouring into his live stream, he knew one thing for certain. The spark had been lit. The moral of the story was clear: power, whether given by authority or wealth, comes with responsibility. And it's only when we hold ourselves and others accountable that we can build a world where dignity and respect are afforded to everyone, no matter where they sit. As the news of Elon Musk's social experiment spread, the video of the confrontation became a viral sensation, sparking debates across social media, news outlets, and communities worldwide. People were divided. Some praised Elon's bold approach to exposing systemic issues, while others questioned the ethics of the experiment. But one thing was clear: the conversation about accountability in law enforcement and societal biases had been reignited. Back in the park, life slowly returned to normal, though the bench where Elon had sat became something of a landmark. Visitors stopped to take photos, some leaving notes of their own inspired by the words Elon had left behind. "Your story matters. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The simple message resonated deeply, particularly with those who had faced discrimination or felt powerless in the face of authority. For the younger officer, the fallout was immediate and severe. Stripped of his badge and weapon, he faced a public investigation into his conduct, his actions condemned by both his superiors and the public. His partner, though spared disciplinary action, carried the heavy burden of witnessing how quickly unchecked bias could escalate into something far worse. He resolved to be more vigilant in his duties, vowing to ensure that such incidents wouldn't happen again on his watch. Meanwhile, Elon returned to his work with a renewed sense of purpose. At a press conference days later, he addressed the incident directly. "This wasn't about embarrassing anyone," he said. "It was about holding up a mirror to ourselves as a society. Change starts with accountability, and accountability starts with awareness." The experiment may have ended, but its ripple effects continued to spread. The message was clear: no one, rich or poor, powerful or powerless, should be treated with anything less than dignity and respect.